This next panel, we've been teasing this panel all day, which we made a special one for healthcare organizations because this is a major problem. And in my opinion, this year, this is the kind of thing that's going to make the kind of headlines when someone actually loses their lives because of ransomware. And I think everyone will start taking notice even further. So let's go over who our panelists are. We have 5 panelists, superstar group of experts. First up is our moderator, Dominique Shelton, Leipzig, chair of the privacy and data security team at Perkins Coie. What makes Dominique a cyber expert is not only her vast IR experience, her significant litigation experience, or her substantial experience defending regulatory inquiries, but it's also that Dominique has a unique perspective on national and international privacy ecosystems, cyber preparedness, compliance. Dominique has built her career around the juxtaposition and balance of data privacy and data security. And she's a real trailblazer. And if you don't believe me, just read her recent op-ed piece in the Financial Times titled, "U.S. Should Seize the Chance to End Data Sharing Standoff." Most lawyers don't like to write too many op-ed pieces, but not Dominique. She's in the space and she's on it. So welcome, Dominique.
Welcome.
Thanks. Next up is Darren Lacey, who is always one of my favorite panelists. He has been serving as Chief Information Security Officer and Director of IT Compliance for Johns Hopkins University and Johns Hopkins Medicine for the past 15 years. What makes Darren an expert is not just that he is a Harvard lawyer who also has been working in the technology sector as a developer, an attorney, a consultant, an executive for 30 years or so. That's a very rare combination. But it's also that Darren is a true titan of the CISO industry, not just for his brain power, but his candor. He speaks his mind, and he speaks it with a level of authority that very few technologists have. He supervises the technology of 65,000 employees, 50,000 students. We are so thrilled to have a world-class expert like Darren here and can't wait to hear his thoughts. Welcome, Darren. Next up is Devon Ackerman, Managing Director and Head of North America Incident Response at Kroll Cyber. What makes Devon a cyber expert is not just that, like so many of the Kroll professionals, he was an FBI supervisory special agent assigned to the FBI's Operational Technology Division, responsible for oversight and coordination of digital forensics field operations for each of the FBI's 56 divisions. That's a big digital forensics space. But it's also that Devon made his bones early on at the FBI working as a frontlines digital forensic investigator, where he participated in the execution of more than 100 federal and state search and seizure operations, probably making him one of the most experienced digital forensic experts in the country, perhaps even in the world. So welcome, Devon. Can't wait to hear your perspective.
Thank you, John.
Sure. Next up is Kim Peretti, who co-chairs the Privacy, Cyber, and Data Strategy team at Alston and Bird. Kim Peretti is the Ronda Rousey of incident response. What makes Kim a real cyber superstar is not just that Kim is yet another true pioneer in our field, having broken new ground after leaving the computer crime and intellectual property section, CSIPs, and forging a cyber practice at Alston that had barely existed anywhere until she decided to create it. But it's also that Kim is one of the most important thought leaders in cyber. Her presentation and litany of articles are always at the forefront. Just go back to March during the first few days of the pandemic, and Kim was already on it, writing 6 practical tips for practicing cyber hygiene in the middle of a global pandemic before most of us had even begun to consider those issues. It's so great to have a true innovator like Kim on board. She paved her own way, and I can't wait to hear her thoughts on this panel as well. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you, John.
Sure. Finally, Matt Reid. Matt Reid is Managing Director and co-lead of the Los Angeles office of Sard, Verbinnen & Co. And again, we talked about this on one other panel, that having a real crisis manager, a real communication experts within the ecosystem of the incident response is critical. And what makes Matt a cyber expert is not just his 30 years of crisis management experience, which makes for probably a very chaotic life, but it's also that Matt has very specific experience as a critical advisor for healthcare institutions after data security incidents. These are matters of life and death, and seasoned communications experts in the IR space are few and far between to begin with. So welcome, Matt. Very excited to hear your strategies on managing the kinds of crises where people may die. Not an easy situation for anyone. So thanks to you all. I'm going to turn it to Dominique to begin the discussions, and I can't wait to listen to this panel.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all for listening. This is really one of these hot button issues. It has to do with health. It has to do with patient safety and crime. And with that, I just want to open the floor and turn this first question to Kim. What is going on with healthcare and ransomware right now? It seems like we pick up the paper every day and hearing about a hospital or a medical system that's under siege. So talk to us, Kim, about this.
Sure. Thanks, Dominique. So ransomware is not a new challenge for the healthcare industry. Ransomware attacks in the industry reached some of their highest numbers actually in late 2019. 764 healthcare providers confirmed ransomware attacks in 2019. Then we headed into 2020. In the first half, COVID then seemingly gave the sector a reprieve or a brief reprieve from ransomware as some of the hacking groups paused their attacks actually on hospitals. But then by September 2020, ransomware attacks once again began to ravage the healthcare industry. And one of the leading response vendors reported in Q3 of last year that healthcare was the most targeted industry by ransomware groups. Another found that in the last 2 months of 2020, the healthcare sector experienced a 45% increase in cyber attacks, much of it due to ransomware. And this all comes at the tail of an alert issued by our government, by CISA, DHS's CISA, HHS, and the FBI in October, announcing that the government had credible information of an increased and imminent cybercrime threat to U.S. hospitals and healthcare providers by ransomware actors. And that's the exact month when my phone and Devon's phone rang off the hook from our healthcare clients, because it really did, in fact, take place between September and November. More than 12 healthcare delivery organizations experienced EHR downtime because of a ransomware attack. It was really, really significant. And if I could just, from my perspective, I think we should be asking, why are healthcare organizations at the top of the list for this particular type of threat? And three things for me come to mind. One is the sensitive data, the PHI, the patient data that they have makes them a very attractive target. If you take that data and you ransom, there might be a higher chance you'll get paid. They're also a very attractive target because of the potentially devastating consequences of lengthy downtime that could slow or even stop critical processes affecting patient safety, affecting patient care. And we know that the average downtime of a ransomware attack, I don't think many companies are aware, but it's 19 days is the average. It isn't something that even if you pay, it's 2 or 3 days. We're talking weeks of downtime. So those are two reasons. A third reason I would throw in is that the healthcare industry can have legacy systems and infrastructure, which can be more vulnerable or susceptible to attack, as well as it's an industry that's consistently and constantly sort of acquiring physician practices and other groups. And so there's there's systems that haven't been fully integrated, also leaving it to be more susceptible. So just wanted to throw that out to sort of frame and set the stage for our conversation today.
Thank you, Kim. And it's so amazing to see that uptick really did bear out, and you saw this happening in the fall. You mentioned Devon, and from the crisis point of view and just sort of reacting and collaborating with teams of outside counsel as well as the hospital systems themselves. Tell us a little bit about your perspective about what's going on right now with healthcare and ransomware.
Yeah, absolutely. So the healthcare industry is an interesting industry from a standpoint of the vectors into them. Most industries I think could share that the common ones we all hear about. We've probably all of the audience members definitely have heard time and time again, email compromise leading to malware drop. That's a very common one, or VPN, someone's credentials are compromised. Healthcare is interesting because healthcare, I think, in my perspective, has a very large potential platform, as well as a lot of systems that work interchangeably between usually the remote offices, the doctor's offices, the ERP systems, the cloud services, the billing systems. Now, again, corporate America, corporate globally, I think has a lot of similar, But one thing that we've always noticed with our healthcare clients is traditionally they're not always the ones that are the actual victim from a threat actor getting into their systems. They're the downstream victim. Everything from managed service providers potentially being compromised, and then the healthcare system being actually attacked through the trusted relationship, the trusted conduit of technology, the ERP service provider actually being hit and then bringing the databases offline. So healthcare has so many tendrils into other locations and other businesses. I think it is not only going to continue to be a target for threat actors, it's also going to be something that sometimes by virtue of being as spread out as they are, targeted.
Thank you so much, Devon. And I think that really underscores, seeing that this is a rising tide here, Matt, from the standpoint of crisis communications, talk to us about what a ransomware attack is like for a hospital system where, really patients' lives could be on the line.
Yeah, I think, thanks, Dominique. I think that's one of the key considerations here, and also one of the factors that weighs into why healthcare providers are being targeted right now. They are, just by the nature of the public health service that they provide, they're more willing to pay the ransom so they can get back to that public health mission. And a good example of that was our firm represented the University of California, San Francisco School of Medicine back in June when they were hit with a NetWalker attack. And in that instance, the crippling impact was shut down their COVID research. So COVID research and testing that they were doing. And so they were, had this huge motivation to get out there and get back to that mission, that critical mission of addressing this pandemic. And so they paid the ransom and got back up and running, and it was worth it to them. But what was interesting in that instance is it also demonstrated just how effective these threat actors are at using publicity to bring more pressure to bear on their targets. And in that instance, the BBC actually got access to the negotiations between UCSF and the threat actor and published a whole article about the back and forth that took place. So they're bringing more and more pressure to bear. And that key inflection point is these are organizations that do need to get back online to fulfill that public health mission. So there's a real strong impetus for them to get this paid and get back to doing what they do. And the only other thing I would add, and Devon touched on this, is that when you think about the attacks on healthcare, it's not just the healthcare providers themselves, it's the entire healthcare ecosystem. So it's pharma, it's biotech, it's these third-party providers who are providing services for healthcare. They're all under attack right now. And it's crucial that all of them are ready and prepared because they are in the crosshairs at this moment in time.
Well, thank you, Matt. And that really sets the stage perfectly for, I want to bring Darren into this conversation, certainly with your legal background, your tech background, and also working at Johns Hopkins. Talk to us a little bit about what you think is going on. What are these threat actors after with respect to this health data? And there's some great follow-up questions here in the chat, which I'll sort of throw in if there's a way to weave in answers. Alexandra's asking, what is the impact of telehealth on all this? And Leonardo is asking, given tighter budgets following COVID, and so we've got this heightened collection of data because of COVID, but tighter budgets because of it. How do you propose, and Darren, I think you're probably well placed to answer, how do you propose that healthcare organization prioritize these the security investments that they're making? So that's a multi-pronged question, but I wanted to bring in a couple of these good chat questions.
All right. Thanks, Dominique. I will now explain the world because there's a lot there. But let me. I'm going to throw out another hypothesis about why healthcare is getting hit before I actually start answering legitimate questions. And that's because we hire a lot of people. we have lots of employees. And if you operate under a kind of assumption that the adversary sends out many, many phishing messages, and then whatever lands on the good soil, essentially they evaluate and then they do hands-on keyboards attacks from there. If you have a lot of employees, it's more likely to land on good soil. If you have a lot of systems, it's more likely to land on good soil. We're the largest industry in the U.S. economy, so by rights, we should be attractive to a lot of folks. There's no doubt that healthcare IT has always been application driven and not infrastructure driven, and information security is principally an infrastructure play. I think healthcare has improved in the last 10 years on this. It was absolutely abysmal at this 10 years ago. But whether we're keeping up is another question. My take on it, and I'm the least expert on this group because I don't actually deal with it, essentially catastrophic incidents every day. It's usually only a couple times a week, like the other folks on here. So I'm not going to, I can't opine on all the different kinds of ransomware, but I know a few things. It's clear, like with SolarWinds and with a lot of the ransomware attacks I've seen, what you don't want to basically if you're an attacker, you don't want to be in a position where you're scanning the network using Nmap or some other tool and you're trying to find vulnerable machines. That is really a primitive way of essentially breaking an enterprise. What you really want to do is you want to go up in level of abstraction. So if you can basically infect the update system for a tool that everybody in the world uses, like SolarWinds, that's one way to do it. That's a sensible way. The other way to do it is and what we typically see in healthcare is essentially they attack essentially the quote domain controllers, the things that handle all the different administrative access and user access for the environment. This is a very weird and esoteric field and requires a facility with Microsoft technologies, because most of these are Microsoft Active Directory, that most cyber people don't have, let alone anybody else. So it's quite common for organizations, medium to smaller organizations, to be completely at a loss on how to protect these domain controllers. And it's, we spend in our environment, we have, several people who that's all they do is think about essentially domain controller attacks. And, and that's still not enough. So what you'll typically find is that the attacker has gone in and compromised a few of these administrator or domain accounts, and then just started willy-nilly installing backdoors and ransomware. And once you've done that, you not only can wreak havoc on the environment in terms of data exfiltration and ransom notes and all those types of things, you can put in enough backdoors that even were there were no ransom, it would take several weeks to come back up because the credentials that folks use are going to be compromised, and every system's going to have backdoors and it's going to collect credentials. So it's a mess regardless of whether it's ransomware or not. And so many of the attacks I see follow that trajectory, that they try to pop this upstream infrastructure so they can deploy malware downstream to many systems at once.
So this is really important information, and I hope the audience is taking this down. You're saying that the criminals are really after domain control, and so to the degree that exercises can be and steps can be taken to start protecting your domains, that is a takeaway for the healthcare industry. If I'm hearing you correctly, Darren, I think that's a really salient point. I guess I would like to turn a little bit to the reputational part and extortion and everything that goes on with these ransom attacks, where money is being demanded and there's pressure, you've got lives in play. Tell us, I guess I'd like to talk about this in two prongs, bringing that into the conversation about what does this mean for the brand? when you pay money and pay out to just resolve something like you talked about San Francisco being in that situation. And I guess, Kim, I'd like to bring you into the discussion from a legal point of view just right after. Don't we have OFAC guidelines? Do we need to worry whether the criminals are part of a organization or a state-sponsored entity that is on the OFAC no support list? So starting with Matt, you've got the pressure to pay because lives are at stake, your brand, the PR, and everything else. What do you say there?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and one of the big challenges. And I do think as you look at ransomware attacks, that extortion angle, that threat to release data that they have exfiltrated as they implemented their attack, is one of the key developments we've seen over the last couple of years. And in the vast majority of cases today, that's part of the ransom demand. So just as an organization is dealing with this crippling IT attack, they are also facing the threat that patient data could be released, or if you're a pharmaceutical company, confidential intellectual property or testing data. So, and these threat actors are very good at this new angle that they've added on. You look at Maze, and they've got a public website that lists the companies that they're attacking. So there's this public shaming aspect and this looming threat to your reputation and to the relationships you have with patients and with partners, that all this valuable data could be released. And that means that the decision on whether and when and how to disclose that you've been attacked is no longer yours. The threat actors can make this public immediately. They can choose to start to make it public if you're not cooperating. So there's some key considerations from a purely communications and reputation standpoint that companies need to look at, especially healthcare companies where that trust is such an important part of the relationship they have with patients and the role that they play. So first is you do need to look beyond just the baseline notification requirements if you've been attacked, and you need to think about reputation, and you need to think about credibility, and you need to think about trust. There is such a thing as over-communicating in a ransomware situation. So if you're sharing information too soon before you know the facts, or if you're alerting audiences and stakeholders who aren't impacted, you may actually be doing more harm than good. But by saying too little, too late, you're putting your story in the hands of the threat actor. So there's that careful balance that you need to weigh in terms of how do you communicate this. And proactive disclosure and beating the criminals to the punch is usually where you want to land on that side of that balance. It's better for your stakeholders to hear from you because it builds trust and confidence that you have the situation under control. And when you're talking about patients, that you're looking out for their confidential health information. And the only thing I'll add for the audience here is that if you're interested, we have a 2-page kind of key considerations from a communication standpoint. If you're hit by a ransomware attack, what do you need to be thinking about? What are the steps you need to take? Anyone who's interested, I'm happy to share that, because it starts to walk through all those considerations and levers that you need to balance as you're navigating one of these really, really difficult situations from a reputation standpoint.
Matt, thank you, and I'm glad you mentioned that because Colin here in the chat had just asked the question, or what are some of the things that can be taken to neutralize threat actors, PR efforts, and you talked about getting out in front of the story and this 2-pager that you have with more details. So I encourage everyone to ping Matt after this to get that information. Kim, is there any tension between what we've just talked about, and assume you're dealing with a hospital that doesn't have backup systems, say the Active Directory has been compromised and the credentials even to the backup locations have been compromised too. And a company at the healthcare system really doesn't have any other choice to get access to their data but to pay. Where does the OFAC, what happened with OFAC, and where does this come in, or should it come in under circumstances like this? Let me turn it to you.
Before I get to OFAC, so just to remark on what Matt said, I highly encourage everyone to look at that 2-page document, because ransomware events immediately trigger communication issues, and that is where I find we're more caught off guard. We often know how to hire counsel and work through those issues in forensics, but it's the communication that really sneaks up on you in the crisis of the moment. So that's point one. And then I also wanted to mention sort of, the payment aspect for healthcare organizations. I think we've seen a trend in the cases we've been involved in that we haven't needed to pay as much, to restore systems and backups, that there's been a significant amount of improvement over time. And we're more often able to become comfortable that within a time period that will not have patient safety issues or care concerns, restore systems. So I think there's been some significant improvement there. There were, early on, we were often in a position where, the systems, were not able to be restored in any time frame. And so we really were considering payment more often to get that decryption key and get back up and running quickly. And of course, layered on top of this is HIPAA, right? And the HIPAA and healthcare regulations. And so if you didn't pay and weren't able to fully restore systems with, that had PHI or EHR data, you might be in a position where you had to notify. So that was also another significant factor. But more often, as we've seen 2019 and 20 roll out with these targeted attacks where they get in systems and they steal data, they often are looking for PHI because they know that's very sensitive. It's patient data. And I think that's really what puts company the hardest decision is, deciding, we know the criminals might have got sensitive data and it can immediately show up on a URL that's publicly available, and how detrimental that would be to patients. So that is one of the more challenging decisions for healthcare companies in these ransomware attacks. Now, of course, if there was more and more information that came out, Devon, that the criminal actors may not leak it, but may sell it within a couple months, I think that would be information that would be very valuable. I don't know how often that happens, but that would certainly mitigate the, making any real need to pay or have any effect of the payment. So then back to OFAC, and I'm sure I know there was a whole panel on OFAC. There's been a lot discussed on OFAC. It isn't sort of new guidance, but it's certainly a paper by the government that says facilitating payment may be a violation of OFAC regulations, and that would be if the Bitcoin wallet related to an entity that was on the SDN list. That certainly could be a violation, and the government's made that very clear in the paper. However, they've also made clear that the company should have a compliance program and do due diligence checks, and that a significant factor of whether OFAC would bring an enforcement or have an enforcement response, a significant factor would be if you work with law enforcement in the aftermath of an incident and in your decision, to pay. So I think, I don't think that OFAC guidance is going to stop, payment. In many cases, it could. We haven't seen, entity after entity be added to that list that would impact this right now. Of course, that could happen over time, but it is a very important, of course, piece of guidance because it's a strict liability standard that if you are found to have engaged in a transaction and that Bitcoin wallet actually does relate to an entity that's on that list, that you could be subject to civil penalties. So something very important to consider, to do your due diligence list, and often your third-party intermediaries will do that for you. They have, they can link the Bitcoin wallets to many different actors. They've collected that information over time. There's different ways to do those due diligence checks to get some level of comfort that, currently you aren't paying an entity on that list. So important guidance to be aware of.
Great. Well, I want to thank you, Kim. That is so helpful. And I see a bunch of great takeaways for the audience here is really what you're saying is look at what you can stand up and hopefully avoid having to pay anything. Look at what your redundancies are. And this brings us to the discussion of backups and how that plays into a decision of whether or not to pay anything. And so, Devon, I want to bring you into the discussion a little bit about, having a backup system that hasn't been compromised. How much does that play into the decision forensically about whether or not to make a payment? Obviously, I think most companies would like to get their access to their data and not pay anything ideally, but how can they be in the best position to do that? Piggybacking off of what Kim was just mentioning.
I know, certainly. That's a good question. So before I dive kind of deep into the backup part, just to level set for the audience, the intrusion lifecycle that usually predates ransomware, and Darren touched on this briefly earlier, traditionally with ransomware, at least certainly with modern ransomware, there's an intrusion lifecycle that predates the ransomware moment in time or detonation, right, where the system suddenly begin encrypted. And so that intrusion lifecycle is what most of us in the IR community are trying to position our clients so that the next time that the intrusion begins and those steps begin to crescendo within an environment, that we have a castle wall doctrine put in place where we have walls that are going to trigger and fire, whether you're talking about an MDR or EDR solution or whatever buzzword that might mean something. Ultimately, a solution in place that's going to allow you to understand the triggers, like what Darren mentioned earlier, the domain controllers potentially having unauthorized activity on them, or your ERP system having unauthorized login. Ultimately, you want to catch the things before it gets all the way to that ransomware event. So, intrusion lifecycle, if we can't mitigate an intrusion before it comes to a ransomware event, then that leads us into this backup discussion. So backups are really interesting. I think a lot of industry, probably a lot of industries represented in this audience are going to look at backups traditionally from a disaster recovery standpoint. If a hard drive fails on me, where am I going for my backup? Traditionally tape, traditionally a backup that's accessible from a snapshot, or if we have some type of natural disaster, physical destruction, insider threat deleting data. Most of the way we look at backups within our industry, and I think still so, I think there's this bell curve where a lot of companies are starting to change their mindset, especially in the wake of ransomware over the last couple of years. Most backup solutions, though, are targeted for, if I have a disaster event, where do I go back to? Not from a mindset or a actor responsive mindset of, if someone's been in my network for days, weeks, months, and then decides to not only attack my live systems encryption, but attack my backups, how am I countering that? And so we're no longer talking about a disaster recovery in the traditional sense of a hard drive went bad on me, or I had a fire in my building or my data center, but the bad guy had access to the network just like one of my authorized administrators. To Darren's point earlier, I compromised a domain admin account from the domain controllers, and now I'm acting as one of your own employees. If the employee can access the backups, so potentially can the threat actor. And that's the piece that I think we need to slowly change. Again, I think a lot of healthcare professional associations, especially the ones with very mature SOCs and security programs, I think recognize this. I think there's still an evolution, though, to shift the backup discussion towards, if a bad guy is in and can operate just as freely as one of my IT team members, my IT security team members, are the backups truly secure? And to kind of wrap this all in a nice little bow on top, ultimately, if you're looking at your backups from a perspective of, if a bad guy has access to this, like one of my employees, and can delete the data or attack the data, then now we're putting redundancies likely in place, or we're putting a system in place that is either completely relying upon something that's non-network connected, where you have a primary backup solution that is network accessible, and you have a backup solution that's not network accessible. Certainly there's cost, there's infrastructure, there's solutions, decisions in there. For an organization like Darren's with 50, 60, 100,000 plus endpoints, you obviously have to make decisions. Data storage, not necessarily the cheapest, but it's within a budget, right? But ultimately, you have to make a decision of what are you backing up, so that when you have potentially an event like this, a worst case scenario ransomware event, you can balance the being able to back up with the ability to potentially have data off location, if you will. And the last thing I think I'll add on this is a lot more of the threat actors understand, especially in the ransomware space, that they want you to come to them. They want to control the narrative. And that's why we saw the evolution of the migration to data exfiltration or acquisition, right? They know a lot of organizations have a backup solution in place, and organizations have the ability to recover from backups. Well, I can keep you at the negotiation table if I, the bad guy, have now taken your data before the ransomware event. You may be able to fully restore from the threat actor to the victim kind of discussion, right? But I have your data. And so you still want to talk to me, or I'm going to post your data as the bad guy. So that backup solution is part of the discussion, but there's still this other aspect that threat actors have definitely matured and evolved to from a targeting standpoint.
You know, it's amazing just listening to Devon, how sophisticated the criminals have become. And I think everybody here in the audience has heard these sort of horror stories, or maybe otherwise, where you have the criminals that basically have help desks to help you decrypt the data and will walk you through things. And so they have some incentive to be reliable after you pay a ransom, so that they have reputations on the market to protect. I want to bring Darren into the discussion. I know this wasn't on our pre-planned list, but just in terms of what Devon was talking about, protecting the backup systems. And I mean, do you have any thoughts there, from that standpoint, for healthcare providers?
Yeah, I mean, actually, this is an area where healthcare is a little different than other industries. Maybe not, essentially Goldman Sachs. Probably Goldman Sachs is more like this than we are. The life cycle of data in healthcare organizations, especially primary care providers, in essentially acute care situations like hospitals, data that's a day old is not that useful really. So typically what happens in a healthcare organization, especially a healthcare provider, is that we have multiple layers of integrity checking and backups, weekly backups, monthly backups, daily backups. We have for the applications, for the network shares and all those types of things. There are all kinds of controls you can put on that. You can use all kinds of read-only hashes and other types of things. So offline, put it in the cloud, take it whatever off the network means, which is actually more complicated. You could spend, the lawyers on here. This one is brutal. Just making your way through what counts as a sophisticated enterprise backup strategy beyond basically just Windows backups of servers that's going to be a hard problem for non-technical folks to deal with for a while. So backups, because of how fast data works through our environment, we're talking about a data integrity issue that has to be kind of worked out. And so it seems that most of the ransomware that I've seen, the backup system just got messed up. They just deleted the backups and those types of things. But as you go to more sophisticated attack scenarios against more sophisticated organizations, peeling back the backup problem will be a big part of the forensic job. I spend a ridiculous amount of time basically thinking about the encryption of backups and hashing of backups and where they're all located and how they're moved around the environment. And it is, I have this table that just is incomprehensible, even to me. So I would expect this to be one of the hot areas over the next few years as we try to unpeel the new improved backup regime.
That's so well said, and I'm looking forward to following your work on this, Darren, and others in the industry. Kim, I want to talk to you about this same question because there's a lot going on, as you mentioned, HHS and other implications. Can you kind of come at the backup situation from the legal point of view?
Yeah, no, and that's another area where the healthcare industry is unique in approaching ransomware, in contrast to non-healthcare related non-covered entities or business associates because of HIPAA. And if you have, and now what we've heard and where the landscape is with ransomware is the attackers are getting into the system, they're moving around systems, they're doing recon, they try to put out their malware onto various systems. And if those systems impact PHI, even if they don't, the HHS guidance has said that this is a security incident, you need to investigate. But if the criminal actors have implicated and impacted PHI, then you're in, HIPAA risk assessment land, and you have to take a very detailed look based on the forensics on whether the data, whether there was a low risk of compromise or whether there was a breach. Now, where this crosses over into the backups is, in our experience, sometimes the backups aren't perfect, as Darren mentioned, or there can be a gap. There can be a period of time where the data is lost unless you pay and recover it. So if you have, you have to do a review to identify, well, what data was it? What systems were impacted? What did we lose? And if there's permanent loss of PHI, that may trigger a notification requirement based on the risk factor, not always, but one of the mitigating factors is restoration of data in the risk assessment analysis. So I think that's one thing that makes healthcare ransomware unique from a legal perspective. And then of course the other problem with now these targeted attacks and criminals roaming in the system is that if they have impacted a system with PHI, that there is a presumption that it's been compromised unless you can prove otherwise. And that's very different, that presumption, than just the straight up legal analysis under the state data breach notification statutes. Why that's so complicating here is in many of these sophisticated ransomware attacks with the tools that they use, there often isn't enough evidence left behind, as Devon knows, when we work side by side with Kroll in these investigations to help us get to understand, to overcome that presumption. So then we're immediately in notification land, and that's very different than other industries that aren't subject to HIPAA and the healthcare regulations.
Thank you, Kim. And actually, in making that answer, you did respond to Leonardo's question about the increased risk for notification. So that kind of came up but Leonardo had another question in the chat, and I think we have time for everybody to respond to this one. But I thought it was really good, so I want to make this maybe our last question. I think we have till 11:50, so we got a good 6 minutes to discuss this, but. The question is, Leonardo Saracchini's question is, what is the panel opinion on the dangers of a vendor being impacted by ransomware and affecting the hospital's data? And he's giving an example of Blackbot and others. And so let me start with, last time I haven't heard from Matt, so let's start with Matt. And then if everybody, maybe Matt, Darren, Devon, and we'll have Kim give the last word. What about vendors, how do we deal with this in this ransomware situation as far as they're impacting hospital systems?
It's a huge issue. So it's a great question. And as a matter of fact, we've had to deal with a number of clients who are not the primary healthcare provider, but their business is serving healthcare organizations, and they were the ones who were attacked, and they were impacting the delivery of care. So from a reputation standpoint, it's not only their own reputation that is suffering, it's all of their customers. And it creates this huge challenge when you look at it from a communication standpoint, because they are communicating to their customers. And if there is confidential health information that was compromised, then it's their customers who are having to go out and talk with their patients. So it creates this kind of multi-layered challenge from a reputation standpoint. And it is one of the key access points for these types of attacks that we've seen. And in counseling our clients in those situations, that's one where the over communicating to your customers is absolutely crucial, because they're the ones who, it's their data, it's their patients' data that is at risk. And so making sure they are fully armed and up to speed on the status of the attack, whatever kind of messaging and information we can provide so that they can deliver that message and preserve those relationships that they have with patients is absolutely crucial.
Darren, any thoughts about vendors and controlling risks to healthcare companies in light of that?
It's very difficult to tell what's actually going on with a vendor. Ultimately, they can fill out a bunch of forms, they can get certified for this, that, but you can't really tell how vulnerable they are, how unlucky they are when something like this hits. I think in my field, I'm going to gripe at the security community for a bit. I think we spend way too much time worried about the twig in someone else's eye when we have a log in our own. It is a problem. It comes up from time to time more frequently than we'd like. Don't think there's a ready solution, but the time we spend trying to mull over what the solution might be is time we could try to figure out how to do a better job on the assets that we manage, and because we're not doing a great job even on that.
Thanks, Darren. I love the twig and log analogy. That's great. Devon, what's your thought about vendors?
I think both Matt and Darren, and I know Kim's going to have good points on this too. Bottom line is evaluation of the relationships and evaluations of, not to step into the legal aspect, but the contracts. The big thing traditionally we're seeing is that sometimes the contracts don't have the ability for a vendor, someone like maybe Darren's shoes, to potentially audit that third-party vendor's security and systems. And again, absolutely agree with Darren. Traditionally, we're brought in from a Kroll perspective as that kind of third-party validator of fact from the investigative angle. And we don't dive into the contracts, but it is something we then kind of hear tangentially or on third-party conversations where, we can't push that question, or we can't ask that, or that vendor was potentially the source of this, and we don't have any legal recourse potentially from the contractual piece to dig into this a little bit or to ask for things. The software and the method of access is probably the last two things I'll talk about very briefly. Ultimately, however, that vendor has the ability to touch your systems. However, the third-party vendor potentially leaves tools behind. There should be an audit put in place, and I absolutely, I'm sure this probably echoes deeply with Darren and his community and his team under him, that ultimately we have to have some responsibility, I think, if a vendor is coming into our systems, whether it's something like a PAX server, and it's very much a black box as far as administration, it's only the manufacturer, or it's something where you have a vendor coming in for a very specific tool or software, we have to clean up afterwards, right? We have to potentially make sure that their access, their software, their tools have some type of an audit trail that we then can potentially investigate, or that someone like in Darren's shoes can potentially have a comfort level that's not going to be an open window later.
Thank you. And I know Kim, just one last word on vendors. I know you have really written the book on this.
Sure. No, just 15 seconds on a nuanced point. So conduct your security assessments. It's trust but verify, right? Conduct your security assessments and follow up on the remediation with the third party. Make sure you track the remediation to a time frame. You follow up. More often than not, we have the entities identifying the security issues with their third parties, but just not following to completion.
Thank you so much. I want to thank the panel. It's been a pleasure talking to you about this very important issue, and I hope the audience will continue to follow ransomware in the healthcare space. And with that, I'll turn it over to Bruce.
Thank you, Dominique. Terrific job, and great job for the whole panel. John did not oversell. This is a great panel on a really important topic, so thank you all. Really appreciate it.